It was supposed to be a respectful and patriotic panel, an American governor, a foreign military leader, and an audience ready to hear about shared values. That's the phrase Kristi Noem kept repeating before going on stage, shared values. The organizers of the International Summit chose her to represent American strength. But what they didn't expect was that she'd be sitting across from a man who wasn't there to smile and agree. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had been invited. At the last minute, after a powerful speech he gave at the African Sovereignty Forum went viral. His appearance caused a stir before he even landed in Washington. D.C. Western media labeled him a populist and a strong man. But many African youth saw him as a symbol of resistance. To Kristi Noem, he was a problem. The moment they sat on opposite sides of the stage, the tension was obvious. The moderator smiled, unaware of what was coming. Governor Noem, Captain Traoré, thank you both for being here. Today's topic is freedom and order in a changing world. Kristi spoke first, calm, confident, and rehearsed. Let me be clear, she said, looking around the room. America leads because we set the standard. We don't just talk about freedom, we protect it. But not every culture follows the same rules. Civilization comes at a cost, and not everyone's willing to pay it. It was a subtle attack, but everyone knew who she meant. Traoré sat still, focused. The moderator turned to him. Captain, would you like to respond? Traoré didn't pause. Freedom, he said calmly, isn't about how many McDonald's you can open or how fast you can watch Netflix. In my country, freedom means standing up to foreign control and building our future without asking for permission. The audience murmured. Kristi leaned forward, her voice sharper now. That sounds noble. But let's not confuse rebellion with civilization. Some of us had to fight to bring order from chaos. Others seemed to enjoy living in it. The room went silent. Traoré slowly turned his head toward her, and his voice turned cold. You say we live in chaos, he said. But maybe the real chaos is a system that looks clean on the outside, while secretly stealing everything. The moderator's smile faded. The tension had exploded, and neither side was backing down. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It had become personal. Kristi Noem came to the stage, expecting a debate of ideas. But what she faced was a challenge to her identity, her beliefs, and even her power. She sat up straighter, her voice colder now. You talk about stealing, she said, locking eyes with Traoré. Let's be honest, the only thing the world ever took from regimes like yours is instability. You call it sovereignty. We call it falling backward. The crowd began to react. Some leaned in. Some leaned away. Traoré gave a slight smile, not cocky, but as if to say, now you've really started something. His voice stayed. Come, you think your presence is progress, he said. But you come to our countries with aid in one hand and business deals in the other. You build military bases before you build schools. And when we speak up, you say we're ungrateful. Kristi's eyes narrowed. It's called structure, she said sharply. Something your region badly needs. That was the turning point. Traoré leaned forward, not angry, just focused. You wear structure like a mask, he said. But underneath it is exploitation. Your peace is built on silence. You control the story. And when we finally speak, you call us uncivilized. The moderator shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Kristi quickly responded. Burning flags, overthrowing governments, banning journalists. Is that what you call civil? Traoré replied without missing a beat. Is it civil when you remove elected leaders with sanctions and bribes? It's civil when your companies dig up our land and leave us in debt. You write laws with clean hands while the damage is done behind the scenes. The room was silent. No clapping, just shock. And then came the moment that would explode across the internet. Kristi, her voice cutting and full of contempt, looked him in the eye and said clearly into every microphone, "You're uncivilized." The words hit like a hammer, without blinking. Traoré turned to her and calmly said, "You're unmasked." That was all it took. The crowd didn't cheer. They exploded with energy, shock, and noise. Phones came out instantly, tweets started flying, and the moment was captured forever. That one line would be replayed in newsrooms, schools, and government offices around the world. In that instant, it became clear. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was something bigger. The room didn't recover. For a few long seconds, it was just noise, gasps, cameras clicking, diplomats whispering in disbelief. Even the moderator stood frozen, cue cards hanging useless in his hands. Kristi Noem finally broke the silence, her voice slower now but sharp. "You think a few slogans can shame me?" she asked, shaking her head. "You stand on these stages throwing blame, but where's your responsibility? You cry about Western exploitation, but your people still line up for our visas. You attack our systems, yet you depend on our medicine, our banks, our technology." Traoré listened quietly, then nodded once, almost as if she'd walked right into his response. "I don't blame you for thinking that," he said. "You grew up in a house of mirrors. You think reflection is reality." The audience leaned in again. "Yes, we line up for visas because you ruined our economies and then told us to come clean your houses. We use your medicine because your labs stole our plants and sold them back to us. We bank with your systems because you made sure we had no alternatives." Kristi leaned back, her smile tight. "So, now you're the victim," she snapped. But Traoré's expression didn't change. "No," he said clearly, "I'm the result." That line didn't need to be loud. It hit hard because it was undeniable. "You act like history started the moment you showed up," he added. "Like civilization only began when your flag was raised. But we had laws long before you had plumbing. We had peace before you drew borders, and we had pride before you taught us shame." The room went quiet again. Ambassadors, activists, even military officers started shifting in their seats. You could see in their eyes that some were no longer neutral, sensing she was losing control. Kristi Noem tried a new approach. "You're romanticizing a broken system," she said. "Your people are still poor, still suffering, still dying under your leadership. So forgive me if I don't take moral lessons from someone who can't even keep the lights on in his own country." That hit differently. A few people nodded, some clapped awkwardly, but Traoré stood, not to leave, but to speak louder. "Let me be clear," he said. "We don't want your pity. We want you to stop pretending your hands are clean while you stand on the ruins of what you helped destroy." There was no script for what was happening now, and the whole world was watching. What was supposed to be a polite panel about shared values had turned into a global confrontation between polished power and raw, unapologetic truth. And Traoré, standing tall in uniform, wasn't just a speaker anymore. He had become a storm. Kristi leaned into her mic, voice low but cold. "You keep blaming the West for everything. At some point, don't you have to take responsibility for your own failures?" Traoré nodded slightly, his eyes steady. "I do take responsibility," he said, "and we are working to fix them. But what I won't do, what I refuse to do, is pretend that your success wasn't built on our destruction." Kristi folded her arms and gave a slight smirk. "How convenient." "No," he said, "it's documented." Now the room was silent, not out of politeness, but because no one knew what would come next. Traoré continued, "You want to talk about failure? Let's talk about countries that export war, that destabilize entire regions, and then offer peace talks as if they didn't cause the chaos. You want to measure civilization with GDP and skyscrapers, but not with how many cultures you've erased to build them." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Your stability depends on our silence," he said. "And now that we're finally speaking, suddenly we're the threat." Kristi narrowed her eyes. "You think this is truth? This is just propaganda wrapped in poetry?" "No," he replied sharply. "This is what truth sounds like when it stops asking for permission." The moderator finally stepped in, clearly nervous and trying to take back control. Let's try to refocus," he said. "Maybe we can talk about common ground or shared challenges." But Traoré didn't even glance his way. "There's no common ground," he said calmly. "Between the one holding the whip and the one wearing the scars." The entire room fell silent. Kristi Noem stood now, her arms stiff at her sides, clearly shaken. "So, what's your goal, Captain?" she asked. "You want to isolate yourselves, burn every bridge, walk away from the global community?" Traoré looked up at her, still completely calm. "We're not burning bridges," he said. "We're just tired of being the ones forced to kneel on them." Flashbulbs lit up the room. Phones captured every word. And it was clear this wasn't just a heated exchange anymore. It was a turning point. A crack had been split wide open, and no amount of diplomacy could patch it. The summit hall was full of tension, like a powder keg ready to blow. What began as a scripted, polished discussion had turned into something raw, real, and dangerous. Kristi Noem stood firm, fists clenched. Her instincts told her this wasn't going her way. This wasn't a friendly rally or a cable news set. This was the entire world watching, and Traoré was taking control of the narrative. She stepped forward and spoke through gritted teeth. So, you want to rewrite history? Erase everything good we've done, just to play the victim? Traoré didn't flinch. History doesn't need to be rewritten, he said. It needs to be read, fully. Not just the parts that make your flag look good. The room didn't applaud. They barely breathed. Kristi pushed harder. What do you actually want, Captain? You reject our help. You insult our leaders. You disrespect our allies. So what's your vision? A world with no order, no rules. Just chaos led by people like you? Traoré's voice dropped, but his words cut deep. You think we want your throne? He asked. We don't. He paused, letting silence do the rest. We want you off it. The gasps that followed said everything. Some diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The moderator even dropped his pen. Traoré spoke again, steady and firm. You can't dominate the table for decades and then blame us for flipping it. The moment we finally stand up, he said, we're not here for revenge, we're here to claim space. Kristi Noem was clearly shaken now, her usual calm gone. You come here pretending to stand for justice, she snapped. But your idea of justice sounds a lot like bitterness. Traoré took a step forward, not aggressively, but with purpose. This isn't bitterness. He replied, it's memory. And what makes you uncomfortable is that we remember things your system depends on us forgetting. Then he turned, slightly toward the audience, not just addressing her anymore. You called me uncivilized. But what do you call a civilization that drops bombs before building schools? That lectures before it listens? That takes without ever asking? He gently pointed down at the summit stage. You say this is a seat at the table, but you never asked if we were hungry, only if we were obedient. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was surrender. In just a few powerful moments, Traoré had flipped a centuries-old story, and Kristi Noem, once in control, now found herself on the defensive. The summit was no longer a polished diplomatic event. It had turned into something raw and honest. Like a global confession, the audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were reflecting on their own roles in the system. Trying to recover, Kristi turned away from Traoré and addressed the crowd. Let's be clear, she said, her voice strong again. American influence has brought stability, freedom, and progress to nations around the world. We're not perfect, but we don't apologize for leading. There was some polite applause, mostly from the usual places, diplomats, allies, and aid workers. But it didn't carry. Traoré waited, then spoke again, his voice low and sharp. You don't apologize for leading, he said, because you've never admitted what you've destroyed. The words landed like ice. This isn't diplomacy. This isn't diplomacy, Traoré continued. This is exposure. You wear words like freedom and democracy like armor. But when we use them, you call us radicals. When we defend ourselves, you call it aggression. When we say no to your terms, suddenly we're unstable. He paused, letting his words land. Your entire version of peace depends on us staying silent while you stay in the spotlight. Kristi stepped forward, her frustration slipping through. You want us gone? Fine, she said. But don't come running when your borders fall, when your people suffer, when your enemies rise. Traoré lifted his head, not in anger, but with steady calm. We're already suffering, he said. Not because we stood alone, but because we stood behind you. And there's only one thing worse than suffering. Suffering to protect someone else's image. A quiet stir moved through the room. This wasn't just a speech anymore. It was a breakdown of everything. Unspoken. Kristi tried one last angle, reaching for emotion. You think I don't care? She asked. You think we sit in rooms like this and sleep peacefully while people are hurting? Traoré tilted his head, took a breath, and replied, No. I think you sleep because you've convinced yourself the pain is necessary. That line didn't get applause, it brought realization. In that moment, Kristi Noem wasn't just arguing with a soldier, she was staring into a mirror, and the reflection wasn't easy to look at. The silence in the room had changed. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was electric. Round the world, people were glued to their screens, newsrooms already drafting headlines, commentators preparing to weigh in. But inside that summit, all the polished diplomacy had been stripped away. Kristi crossed her arms, done pretending. "You talk about pain like it's yours alone," she snapped. "You think America hasn't bled? We've sacrificed for peace. We've given more to this world than any empire in history." Traoré nodded slowly, taking in every word. Then he answered, not with heat, but with quiet precision. "You bled," he said, "but you chose where to bleed. You chose when, and most of the time. You bled on land that wasn't even yours." Kristi flinched not outwardly, but inside, her hands tightening just slightly. "Yes, you helped some," Traoré continued, "but you buried many more. You talk about sacrifice, but it was always your choice. Ours was taken from us." The audience felt it. People in the front row shifted, uncertain whether to clap or just stay still. Traoré stepped forward again, not to threaten, but to be fully seen. "You mistake control for care," he said. "You arrive with aid after the damage is done. You organize conferences after the resources are gone. You support elections after the chaos you helped cause." Kristi raised a hand, trying to cut him off. "No," she insisted. "We show up because we're needed. When the world falls apart, who do they call? You," Traoré replied calmly. "Because you're the ones who broke it." A wave of gasps rippled through the hall this time. Fewer people bothered to hide them. "You've turned crisis into a business," he said, "and every time we stand on our own, you pull the ground out from under us and say, 'See, you still need us.'" Kristi's voice softened to nearly a whisper now, stripped of confidence. "Then what do you want from us?" she asked. Traoré didn't pause. "Nothing," he said. "And that's what terrifies you." He turned to the crowd. "We don't want charity. We don't want speeches. We just want to stop being interrupted." The room grew heavier with silence. "You've told your story for centuries," he said. "Now it's our turn." And for the first time during the entire confrontation, Kristi Noem had nothing to say, not because she didn't have words, but because she finally understood something frightening. She was no longer in control of the narrative. A storm doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it comes with a silence so deep, it feels like the air has already been torn apart. That's where the room now sat, in the kind of quiet that follows a truth too big to ignore. Kristi's silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. But in that tiny pause, in the moment she hesitated, everything changed. She no longer looked like the voice of civilization. She looked like a guest in someone else's awakening. She took a breath. "You've made your point," Kristi said slowly, each word deliberate. "But standing on a stage and blaming us for everything doesn't fix your region. It doesn't power your grid or end your wars." Traoré turned his head slightly, calm, not angry. "No," he replied, "but it stops yours from being the only voice in the room." Kristi said nothing, so he continued. "You can't fix what you refuse to face. For decades, you've controlled the story, deciding who's civilized, who isn't, who gets aid, who gets sanctions, who's seen as stable, and who's branded a threat." He stepped forward, not to intimidate, but to be unmistakably present. "Your voice was never the only one," he said, "just the loudest." A ripple ran through the crowd. Kristi, searching for control, reached for the flag. "We've done more good than harm. We've lifted nations, built roads, educated girls, fought extremism." Traoré gently cut in, with cameras capturing every word. "Yes, you did those things, but only when it served your interests. You liberated when it benefited you. You supported education when it matched your politics. You fought extremism with bombs and then asked us to clean up the wreckage." Kristi clenched her jaw. "So, you think we're the enemy?" "No," he said quietly. "You think you're the savior." That landed harder than any insult. And then, with the whole world watching, Traoré delivered the line that would echo across continents. "We're not your project. We're not your burden. We're not your unfinished story. We are the voices your textbooks erased. Finally learning how to write our own. The hall froze. No one moved. Because for the first time in that room, power wasn't about titles, money, or microphones. It belonged to the one who spoke last and meant every word. The summit was no longer just diplomacy. It had turned into a reckoning. What once looked like a panel now felt like a courtroom, and centuries of foreign policy, cultural dominance, and selective storytelling were suddenly under trial. And Ibrahim Traoré was the one holding the gavel. Kristi Noem stood still, hands resting on the podium, the American flag pinned to her jacket. But the usual strength that symbol carried, it felt fragile now. You talk like you're innocent. Kristi finally said, her voice sharp and shaking. As if your own governments have never caused violence. As if your hands are clean. Traoré didn't even blink. No one's hands are clean, he replied. But some keep washing theirs in the blood of others and calling it peace. The room went still again. Every sentence he spoke now felt like it belonged on front pages. You say we're angry, we are. You say we're bitter, we are. But we didn't come here to be healed. We came to stop being hurt. Kristi's voice rose with frustration. You blame everyone but yourselves. Is there any part of your struggle that you'll take responsibility for? Traoré answered without hesitation. I take responsibility every single day. When I wake up in a country stripped of its resources, where our youth are fed lies, and where hope is shipped in from abroad. But I will not take the blame for your crimes, just because you wear suits when you commit them. Another wave of gasps filled the air. He stepped forward slowly, voice low and sharp, every word cutting with clarity. You still don't get it, he said. We don't want to be heard. We want to be left alone. Kristi scoffed. Left alone. The world's connected. You can't just unplug. He shook his head. We didn't plug into the world. The world plugged into us, stole our resources, rewrote our laws, chose our leaders, redrew our borders. And now you say we're part of your system. The room was no longer neutral. It had shifted. Even the moderator stayed silent, pale, unsure how to move forward. We're not asking for applause. Traoré continued. We're asking for withdrawal, not your support, your absence. A few people clapped, then more. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Kristi Noem stood frozen, her silence louder than any words. Not because she lost the argument, but because she lost the illusion that she still controlled it. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. What had been said, and broken, hung heavy in the air like smoke. Kristi glanced down at her notes, not to read, but just to give her hands something to do. Across from her, Ibrahim Traoré stood still, calm, unsmiling. Not victorious, just intentional. He wasn't there to win a moment. He came to shake the entire system. The moderator finally cleared his throat, his voice thin and nervous. Well, perhaps we've uncovered some difficult truths today, a reminder of how important it is to listen, even when it's uncomfortable. No one clapped. Not yet. Kristi finally spoke again. But this time, her voice had no edge, no slogans, just tired defiance. You want to walk away from the world? She asked quietly. Fine. Just don't expect us to clean up what comes after. Traoré looked her straight in the eyes. We've been cleaning up what came after you for 100 years, he said, calm, firm, and devastating. Then, stepping back from the podium, he spoke one final line. Not to Kristi, not even to the audience, but to the cameras, to the world. You've written our story long enough, he said. Now, we're taking the pen back. At first, there was silence. Then one person stood, a young woman, maybe a student, then another, then 5, then more. No cheering, no shouting. Just a quiet wave of people rising, not in agreement or outrage, but in understanding. Traoré didn't smile. He simply nodded, turned, and walked off the stage. No handshake, no bow. Kristi stood alone under the lights, blinking, her lines used up, her message unmasked. For decades, the West had done the talking. Today, someone finally talked back. And this time, they didn't ask for the microphone, they took it. What was supposed to be a polite debate turned into something far more powerful, a demolition. Kristi Noem walked onto that stage to deliver a lesson. Ibrahim Traoré showed up to confront the myth behind her message. She came with rehearsed lines. He brought a history no one wanted to confront. This wasn't just about politics, aid, or democracy. It was about who gets to define words like order, civilized, and justice. And in 10 unforgettable exchanges, Traoré didn't just challenge policy. He exposed the entire performance of power. He didn't insult. He revealed. He didn't shout. He disrupted. And in doing so, he proved something deeper. The West doesn't fear chaos. It fears clarity, especially when it comes from the voices it tried hardest to silence.